Only a few months ago, Pierre Poilievre seemed destined to become Canada's next Prime Minister. Pollsters, political analysts, and even some liberal strategists believed that the Conservative leader had a clear path back to power after nearly 10 years in opposition. His rise looked unstoppable, until an unexpected force from outside Canada's borders reshaped the political landscape: Donald Trump. Welcome viewers to my channel. Please subscribe, like my video and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. Trump's sudden decision to launch what he described as an economic war against Canada stunned both Ottawa and Washington. Tariffs, threats of dismantling trade agreements, and even inflammatory remarks about making Canada the 51st state sent shockwaves across the border. In one stroke, Trump turned himself into the central figure of Canada's federal election, overshadowing the domestic debate Poilievre had worked so carefully to construct. Poilievre, a career politician known for his fiery rhetoric, had built his campaign on a populist message that echoed Trump's own style. He even borrowed a version of Trump's most famous slogan, rebranding it as Canada First. Like Trump, he relished sparring with the media, frequently bragged about the size of his campaign rallies, and recently made headlines for dismissing a female journalist as nothing more than a protester. These tactics thrilled his core supporters, who donned hoodies mocking pollsters with the slogan, "Do you believe the polls?" But what once looked like a winning formula has begun to unravel. Trump's relentless attacks on Canada's sovereignty and economy have enraged Canadians across the political spectrum, fueling a surge of nationalist sentiment that has unexpectedly revived liberal fortunes. The numbers tell the story. In January, the Conservatives enjoyed a commanding lead in Nanos polling, with 47% support compared to the Liberals' 20%. By April, as Trump's rhetoric escalated, the tide had turned completely. The latest Nanos survey showed the Liberals ahead by 8 points, a dramatic reversal in just 3 months. For many Canadians, the similarities between Poilievre and Trump now appear less like strength and more like liability. The slogans, the big rallies, the constant hectoring, it all feels so Trump, said Corey Tennick, a veteran conservative strategist who once helped engineer right-wing campaigns. And people are not loving Trump right now in Canada. Poilievre is like a cheap karaoke version of Trump. This is not the campaign Poilievre had envisioned. His original strategy was to frame the election as a referendum on the lost Liberal decade under Justin Trudeau. Trudeau's final years in power had been marked by rising food and housing prices, a spike in immigration, and mounting frustration with his leadership. Poilievre had perfected his role as a political attack dog against Trudeau, blaming him for inflation and mocking him as an out-of-touch elitist. But the political map was redrawn when Trump's offensive began. Facing relentless pressure from Washington, Trudeau resigned, handing the Liberal leadership to Mark Carney, a respected former central banker with deep international experience. Suddenly, the ballot question shifted, not whether Canadians wanted another term of Liberal rule, but which leader was better suited to confront Trump and defend Canada's interests abroad. That question has exposed Poilievre's weaknesses. As Tennick noted, when his attacks were aimed at an unpopular Trudeau, it worked. Exit Trudeau, enter Trump, and it's a totally changed game. Poilievre hasn't shown that same ferocity against Trump. Political experts argue that Poilievre's rhetorical style, so effective against domestic opponents, risks backfiring when Canadians hear echoes of Trump himself in his speeches. He's not Trump, of course, said Daniel Belland, a political scientist at McGill University. But sounding like someone many of your fellow citizens view as their country's public enemy number one cannot be a good strategy in an election. For now, Poilievre continues to press his case. He warns voters not to hand the Liberals a fourth consecutive mandate and insists that only a conservative government can restore prosperity after years of Liberal mismanagement. Yet his Trump-like bravado has left him vulnerable in an election that increasingly hinges on international threats rather than domestic grievances. Poilievre's personal story underscores his lifelong commitment to conservative politics. The 45-year-old, a father of 2, grew up in Alberta, Canada's most reliably conservative province, before representing a district just outside Ottawa. A political junkie from a young age, he volunteered on campaigns as a teenager, joined the Conservative Club at the University of Calgary, and even reached the finals of an essay contest on what he would do as Prime Minister. He entered Parliament at just 25 and steadily climbed the ranks, eventually serving in Stephen Harper's cabinet before taking over the Conservative leadership in 2022. Today, however, his political future looks far less certain. What once appeared to be his coronation as prime minister has turned into a referendum not on Trudeau, but on Trump, and by extension, on Poilievre's own Trump-like style. Whether Canadians will accept a leader who echoes the rhetoric of their most antagonistic neighbor remains the defining question of the April 28 election. As the campaign trail entered its final stretch, the specter of Donald Trump loomed larger over Canada's politics than ever before. What began as offhand remarks about tariffs and trade escalated into a full-fledged diplomatic crisis, shaking the very foundations of Canada's relationship with its most powerful neighbor. For decades, Ottawa and Washington had quarreled and negotiated, but never had a U.S. president openly threatened Canada's sovereignty in such stark terms. Trump's rhetoric wasn't just about economics. By floating the idea of Canada becoming the 51st state, he struck at the core of national pride. For Canadians, long accustomed to defining themselves in contrast to their southern neighbor, these words landed like a bombshell. Suddenly, the election was no longer about grocery bills, housing affordability, or even liberal scandals. It was about identity, dignity, and the survival of Canada as an independent nation. Into this volatile atmosphere stepped Mark Carney, the newly minted Liberal leader. With his calm demeanor, polished resume, and reputation as an international statesman, Carney presented himself as the man who could stare down Trump and defend Canada's interests on the world stage. To many voters, he seemed like the adult in the room, precisely the opposite of Pierre Poilievre's brash, populist style. Poilievre, for his part, found himself cornered. His slogan of Canada First now rang uncomfortably close to Trump's America First, a comparison his critics used relentlessly. What once sounded like patriotic defiance suddenly felt like mimicry. At rallies, he continued to fire up supporters with attacks on the media and promises to undo Trudeau's lost decade, but his words carried less weight in the face of Trump's looming shadow. Poll numbers confirmed the shift. Canadians who had once flirted with Poilievre's fiery promises began gravitating back to the Liberals, not out of affection for their record, but out of fear of what Trump's wrath might mean under a conservative government. The surge in nationalist sentiment was unmistakable. Flags waved higher at rallies, anthems rang louder, and voters who had grown cynical about politics rediscovered their sense of urgency. For Poilievre, the irony was cruel. He had built his career as one of the most skilled attack dogs in Canadian politics, a relentless critic who thrived on pointing out the failures of others. But against Trump, an unpredictable foreign president who seemed to delight in mocking Canada, his bark felt powerless. Each day that passed made it clearer. This was no longer an election Poilievre could fight on his own terms. Behind closed doors, conservative strategists whispered about a new reality. Their campaign, once laser-focused on domestic discontent, now struggled to reframe itself as a defense of Canadian sovereignty. But every attempt was undercut by Poilievre's own stylistic similarities to Trump. As one strategist confided, it's like asking people to trust a guard dog that sounds exactly like the intruder at the door. The Canadian election of April 28 was shaping up not as a referendum on Trudeau's legacy, nor even on Carney's promises, but as a national verdict on Trump's interference, and on whether Pierre Poilievre was too closely tied, in tone and temperament, to the man Canadians now feared.